Okay, good morning, boys and girls. We're going to continue our review of lesson 9.4, estimating mixed numbers. So let's say you are going to buy fabric because you're going to make a quilt, and you want 3 different pieces of fabric. One that's going to measure 5 1/8 yards, 5 1/8 yards, and 2 3/4 yards, and 8 1/5 yard. And we want to know how many yards is that altogether. About how many, because it's an estimate, right? It's an estimate, and when we estimate, we don't need to know an exact answer. So we're going to use front end estimation to estimate about how many yards of fabric we need to purchase. All right. So what you do, if you think back to when we did front end estimation with whole numbers, you look at the first number. In this case, the first number is the whole number part. And we're going to add our whole number parts. So we're going to have 5 plus 2 plus 8. And 5 plus 2 plus 8 equals 15. 8 plus 2 is 10, plus 5 is 15. Okay? When you're adding mixed numbers and you're trying to estimate the answer, after you do the front end part, by adding up all of the whole numbers, whether they were 1 digits or 2 digits, you add the whole number. Now you have to consider the fraction parts. If the fraction part is equivalent to 1/2 or larger than 1/2, then you have to add one more to your estimate. So let's look at this first one, 5/8. Let's change the color and go to green. Let's say we're looking at this first part, okay? 1/8. Is 1/8, how many eighths would be equivalent to 1/2? How many eighths? The numerator would be half the size of the denominator. Okay, 4. So 4/8 would be 1/2. Is 1/8 equal to 1/2 or larger than 1/2? No, so we don't consider that fraction. We don't have to do anything with that fraction. Let's look at the next fraction, 3/4. How many fourths would be equal to 1/2? So if our denominator is 4, our numerator would have to be 2 to be half of that, right? So 2/4 would be equal to 1/2. So is 3/4 equal to 1/2 or larger than 1/2? Yes. So because it's larger, we have to add 1 to our estimate. Let's look at the last one, 1/5. Is 1/5 larger than 1/2 or equal to 1/2? No, it is not. So we don't have to do anything with that one. We don't have to consider that one either. We only have to consider this one that has a fraction larger or equal to 1/2. So our final answer in our estimate would be about 16, 15 plus 1. And that's our final answer, so we circle it. Now, it is important that you put the word about in your estimate. Otherwise, you're telling the person looking at your work that 5 1/8 plus 2 3/4 plus 8 1/5 equals 16 if you don't put that about in there. Okay? Well, what if you were given something like this instead? What if you were given, let's put a little line here. What if you were given, let's see, what if you were given 2 1/5 plus 8 and 5/10 and 6 and 9/10. Let's say you were given that. Let's make my 0 look like a 0. When you write too fast, sometimes your zeros look like 6s, just like mine did. Okay, so we're going to estimate. So when we estimate, we look at our whole number parts first. Our front end, this is using front end estimation. So we're going to look at our front numbers, which are 2 and 8 and 6. So it's going to be 2 plus 8 plus 6, which equals 8 plus 2 is 10, plus 6 is 16. Okay, now we have to consider our fractions. 1/5, is 1/5 equal to a half or greater than a half? No, it is not, so we do not have to consider that one. How about 5/10? Is 5/10 equal to 1/2 or greater than 1/2? Yes, it is. It's equal. 5/10 is equal to 1/2. So we're going to have to plus 1 for this one. We didn't have to do the first one, but we have to do the second one. Now let's look at the third one. 9/10. Is 9/10 equal to 1/2 or greater than 1/2? Yes, it is. It's almost 1 whole, right? If we had 10/10, it would be 1 whole. So we also have to add 1 for these fractions. So we have our whole numbers plus the 2 that we had to adjust for. So now we have 16 plus 1 is 17 plus 1 is 18. So our answer is about 18. That's our final answer. So we circle it. So you might have all of these that need to be accounted for, or maybe none of them need to be accounted for, or only 1 or 2. You can have a possibility of 0, 1, 2, or 3, depending on how many fractions you're adding together. Okay.